So we are in a series looking through 1 Corinthians. My name's Scott, for those of you who don't know me. I'm one of the, I don't know really what we call ourselves, kind of co-leaders, part of the core leadership team. There's a team of 4 of us that lead Pershore Community Church. And we're working this season through a theme of 1 Corinthians, the first letter of 2 that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. And I printed some notes out here in a font that was far too small, so I either look at you and you're in focus and this is out of focus, or I put my glasses on and I can actually see what I'm saying, but I can't see any of you guys anymore, so we'll see how it works out. Okay. And you know, I've prepared lots and lots of talks in my time, and I remember one of the first times I was asked by our former leader here, Neil, to preach. I was given the opportunity to preach on encouragement. And then the next time I was asked to preach on discouragement. Oh, okay. There's an element of today's talk that's all about Paul giving the church a seriously good talking to. So bear that in mind and bear with me as we look through chapters 4, 5 and 6 of 1 Corinthians. I am not going to read chapters 4, 5 and 6 of 1 Corinthians, but it's some of it. I do want to encourage you to read it because it does make a little bit of uncomfortable reading. But actually it's really easy to try and avoid the tough stuff from the Bible, isn't it? And just go with the comfortable stuff, the stuff that we like, the verses that make us feel good. But actually, it's important that we take the Bible in its wholeness, that we look at every aspect of how God speaks to us through his word. And sometimes that can make for uncomfortable reading. And we might not even all necessarily have the same viewpoint or mindset for these themes. But when we read tough statements, we need to look at the context within which they were written. So I believe, it's been a few weeks since we've had a chance to delve into Corinthians. So let's just remind ourselves, Paul first visited Corinth. It's a real place. So 1 Corinthians is referring to a letter to the Corinthian people who lived in a place called Corinth. Paul, the author, he first visited Corinth about 15 or 16 years after the death of Jesus and the resurrection. Just a reminder, when Jesus died and was resurrected, he was seen afterwards by, the Bible tells us, at least 500 people on at least 10 different occasions. Who testify to, as it were, the risen, resurrected Jesus. And Paul himself describes a supernatural encounter that he had with Jesus that started him off on what became a personal journey and then a journey to share Jesus with others. And so off he went on what was called Paul's missional journeys, of which going to Corinth was one of those journeys. Corinth itself is about, just so you know, it's in Greece, and it's about 50 miles from Athens. And Athens was a university town. Corinth was a commercial town, a very important commercial town of its time. In those days, there were about 250 what were called free people living in Corinth at the time, and about 250,000 and about 400,000 slaves in Corinth at that time as well. So that makes Corinth as a city about 6 times larger than Worcester, just to kind of put it in perspective. In that time, it was a big place. It was a significant place. It was a commercial district. They were interested, the people of Corinth were interested in Greek philosophy, spirituality, religion. There are at least 12 known temples. And Corinth still exists today. Just putting it in a slightly wider perspective in Greece, you can see some of the other names. Ephesus, that's where the letter to the Ephesians was sent. You can see at the top there, Philippi, the letter to the Philippians was sent. So sometimes it's helpful to put all of these things into a geographic context. And this is Corinth today. This is a Google Maps picture of Corinth today, and what's called the Bay of Corinth that still exists today. And what I found quite interesting, so bear with me for just a moment, is that little line that goes through the middle, because there's an absolutely incredible canal that goes through there that links to really important ports and to really important waterways. And in one sense, that's a legacy of the commercial history of Corinth. So I'm just kind of giving you a bit of a background. You want to see an interesting picture? This is my favorite picture of my investigations into Corinth. That's what the canal looks like. I have no idea how they do that, but that boat has to get all the way through that canal somehow. It's pretty cool, isn't it? So that's the Corinthian Canal as we know it today. Okay, so but back to the time of Paul's writing. This was a place that was full of religion, full of spirituality, full of Greek philosophy. There were at least 12 known temples, and as Phil reminded us when he first introduced this a few weeks ago, just one of those temples was known as a hotbed of gathered sort of prostitutes. There were over 1,000 prostitutes operating around the temple courts at the time. This is all that seems to remain in the old Corinth today of one of the temples of Apollo. So it was described by biblical scholars as a center for open and unbridled immorality. In fact, it was so bad that there was a Greek term to Corinthianize. It was a Greek term which literally meant to practice sexual immorality. So that just kind of, that's how, imagine to Worcesterize. This was to Corinthianize, it's that bad. Just 15 years after the death of Jesus, Paul takes himself out there, passionate about sending a message of good news about Jesus, a new Christian church to form, to bring the message of good news. And not surprisingly, as that church started to form, it became fraught with challenges, being kind of in the world but not of the world, if you like, troubles, temptations, compromises, trials and tribulations. Now, of course, these sorts of challenges never happen in the church today, do they? Only 2 days ago, I pulled this off the BBC website. The one that I saw from about 5 days earlier was too horrific in terms of numbers to want to put on the screen right now. We live in not dissimilar times where we see scandalous challenges within the church, let alone within community. And these were headlines, these were common headlines in the Corinthian church as well. So Paul arrived there, got a job as a tent maker. He knew he was going to have to linger for a while, so he got a job as a tent maker to pay his way, and he committed to staying there for 18 months. He started with the Jews and started to talk to the Jews about Jesus, and there was such hostility, such persistent opposition, that eventually he did a very Jewish kind of Greek thing of the time. He shook his clothes, which apparently is what they do, to say, well, that's it, forget it, I'm having nothing more to do with you. And he turned his attention to the non-Jewish community, or as the Bible refers to them, the Gentiles of the time, and started to share and to build a church of newcomers to the Christian message. And having established that church, he then went off again on another journey, and this time moved across from Corinth to Ephesus. And whilst he was in Ephesus, it wasn't long whilst he was in Ephesus before he started to get feedback on how that church was getting on. You can imagine, can't you? If you've been involved in developing and planting a church, you want to know how it's getting on. You want to get the feedback. Last weekend on Saturday, I went to a Synergy, which is a kind of overarching group of churches, a Synergy church leaders 24-hour retreat. So I joined our Synergy leader, Alad, and other leaders from across other churches for 24 hours, a get away from it all retreat. And guess who I bumped into? A couple called Neil and Joe, who most of you will know were our previous leaders here. And of course, they said, how's it all going? How's it all going? I said, what are you up to, Neil and Joe? They told me about their lovely holiday. Didn't want to talk to them anymore. But they wanted to pass on their love and best wishes to everybody. It was great to see them. So, of course, Paul in Ephesus, he wanted to know how the church was getting on. So he's capturing the news, and the news he's getting is not good. The reports that were coming back to him, the church was struggling. It was struggling to maintain its integrity in such a challenging and cosmopolitan culture. A church described by the theologian David Pryor as one that was struggling with jealousy, rivalry, and, frankly, immoral behavior. So Paul wrote back to them in what we know today as 1 Corinthians. And he did this about 2 to 3 years after leaving Corinth to get to Ephesus. Corinthians are proud people. They're competitive. They're assertive. They're aggressively ambitious. Do we know people like that in this room? Don't look at them if you know they are. No, just checking. Do we see something of that in ourselves sometimes? These people were, by their very culture, highly protective of their rights and freedoms. So not surprisingly, this led to disputes and grievances. But they chose to air them, sometimes very petty grievances, in very public ways. Sometimes going to public courts, making a scene of each other. This was not only the case in the city, but this was the case within the church as well. Christians against Christians in public courts, in disputes. And the church was getting caught up in this mess. Have you ever been caught up in a mess like that? Somebody else's grievance? Feeling really awkward that you actually don't want to be a part of this? I remember when I was in my first university. Most of you will know I work at university. And I was in a university college business school. And we just discovered email. That was exciting. That's how old I am. And I'd got my AOL account. I don't even think it was that. I think it was CompuServe. Anyway, suddenly the university decided we were going to have our own email address, and every member of staff was going to have like the same email kind of link, and we were going to be part of a group because the technology was allowing us to do this, and we employed an email manager. I think that was literally his name, the email manager, to set up groups. So that like we could just not just send like one email to every person, but we could send one to a group of people. I mean, you're listening to me as if I've just returned to the planet after a 40-year break, but it was novel in those days. And so in one of the other schools that was part of my university college, there was a member of staff. We'll just call him Jim, because that was his name. And Jim sent a message to another guy called, let's call him Thomas. And Jim asked Thomas for a bit of help with something, but when Thomas read it, he kind of didn't read it the same way as Jim intended it. It was just a cry for help, whereas Thomas read it as like, are you criticizing me that I'm not helping you enough? So Thomas wrote back to Jim and said, that's really offensive, you beep, beep, beep. I don't really think that was really very helpful. After all, I've done loads of stuff. And Jim was saying, what are you talking about, you idiot? And he sent another message back. But at this point, Jim thought, I'm not having him talk to me like that. So he carbon copied department. And suddenly the whole department sees this kind of and so Tom receives this message back, which was, by this point, a little bit offensive. And Tom thinks, I'm not having this. So he sends a message back to Jim saying exactly what he thinks of him. Carbon copy, CC all. Click, all. Suddenly, the whole of the university staff get involved in this, and about half an hour, and then suddenly there's other emails coming. There's somebody sent an email saying, please don't carbon copy me into this sort of communication. But he carbon copied all of us into that reply. And there was someone else that said, yeah, I think he's a bit of a GIT as well. I think I'm with you on this one, Tom. And someone else said, oh, come on, guys, give us a break, will you? And all these, and suddenly the number of emails, this kind of cloud was evolving. And everybody then went for coffee at coffee break, and everyone felt really, really awkward. You been in that kind of situation? This is Corinth. This is Corinth down to a T. This is what it's like all the time in Corinth. What happened was our principal stepped in and closed down the whole of the email system for 24 hours, called an all-staff meeting and gave us all a jolly good talking to. It was very good fun. Anyway, this was Corinth at the time. So, Paul, in response to this, he starts saying, do you know what? Yes, you can do anything. Of course you can do anything. And you say you can do anything, but actually not everything that you're doing is beneficial, guys. He's quite soft in the first instance. But in other places, he doesn't hold back. Paul writes back. And at the heart of the challenges that the church was facing, and the heart of the challenges that we face today, Paul really asks one question, and that's this: who do you choose to serve? Ultimately, who do we choose to serve? Now, when I was at this retreat last week, we only had 24 hours. There was a lovely lady who was leading most of the sessions, and she began, perhaps not surprisingly, there's a group of about 40 or 50 hours, and she said, "How are you doing? How are you guys all doing? And ladies, how are you doing?" And then we were all starting to formulate in our head the usual Christian leader response to that, yeah? And then she said, no, before you come back to me, how are you really doing? All right? Come on, be honest. How are you really doing? So let me reframe the question here. We might say, well, who do we serve? Well, obviously our answer we know is Jesus, because we were taught that in Sunday school, weren't we? So we're asked the question as church: who do we serve? Who do we really serve? Well, it's Jesus, of course. Who do we really serve? Who do we really serve? Paul says, or the inference from Paul's comments is, there's one of three types of options, really. Are we really, truly devoted to a life that's serving God? Are we more concerned about ourselves, if we're really honest? Or are we more concerned about people pleasing, pleasing others? This was the heart of the real question that Paul was asking the church in these 3 chapters. Indeed, it's why we're looking at the whole of Paul's letter. We called it Life Lessons, because actually, when we look at the challenges, we look at not necessarily at the specific incidences, but the overarching challenges that the church was facing then. Aren't we as church today facing challenge, trying to understand what God's doing in such uncertainty? We've got conflict on our doorsteps. We've got refugees coming into the country. We've got food banks being used like never before. We've got cost of living rises. We've got political uncertainty. In all of those places, the church needs to stand and needs to stand firm. Who do we serve? Imagine this. If God was to send his angels on a holy investigation to come and watch and observe our lives. Leighton and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Our actions, our words, even our thoughts. The things that we say and do publicly, the things that we say and do privately. The holy angels are watching us. They're doing an audit. Are they going to report back and say, yes, 100%, they totally serve you, God, totally? Every one of us? Who's feeling awkward right now? You may say, come on, Scott, that's a bit of a big ask, isn't it? That's a bit of a high call. But Paul himself said later in this same letter, imitate me, he said, as I imitate Christ. That's our call. We're called to be Christ-like, to be like God, not like the world. Again, in a different letter, this time to the church in Ephesus, Paul says, how do we live? Well, imitate God, he says in Ephesians. Imitate God. To another church in Philippi, he said, to live is Christ. Be like Christ. James, another one of the early church leaders, he said, submit yourselves to God. Again, Peter, in one of his letters, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. Who do we serve? Who do we serve? Now, Paul may have tried to role model this, but even Paul had his struggles, but nothing compared to this church in Corinth. So as we've already heard, just in these 3 chapters, 1 Corinthians 4, 5, and 6, we can read about struggles of drunkenness, of greed, of sexual immorality, incest, judging others, as well as hostile public legal actions, all there in difficult chapters to read. Ultimately, Paul recognizes we have a choice. Are we sold on trying to serve others? Are we sold on our own interests and our own desires, or are we sold on trying to serve God? To people please, let's look at this one first. Do we not know people around us who are people pleasers? Have we find ourselves sometimes being a bit of a people pleaser ourselves? Is there a bit of a people pleaser in each one of us? We just want to blend in, don't we? Blend in with society. We don't want to stand out, dare to be different. Oh no, not me. We like to be liked, don't we? Or perhaps we hear it said, well, we don't really have to believe that bit of biblical teaching, do we? It's not the same anymore as it used to be, because it's just kind of not culturally appropriate to think like that anymore, is it? It's not really relevant. Well, I encourage you, read 1 Corinthians 4, 5, and 6. Is it any different to the challenges that we're facing today? Are we people pleasers? A young man joined a major company. He was absolutely bowled over and delighted to have been selected to be the new member of staff for this company. And he admired the company. He'd worked really hard to get the qualifications. He applied for the job, got the job. And in his first week in the company, he found himself in the company of one of his bosses. The phone rang and the boss said, would you get it for me? And so the young employee picked up the phone, and it was Mrs. Robinson. And he picked up the phone and said, oh, Mrs. Robinson. And the boss just looked at her and goes, and the young man listened to Mrs. Robinson on the end of the phone and then said, I'm really sorry, Mrs. Robinson. My boss has just told me that he's not here. Goodbye. And he put the phone down. The boss just went into meltdown, picked up the phone really quickly, fumbled, pressed redial, called up, talked to Mrs. Robinson, dealt with the issue, put the phone down, called the young man into his office, said, what the hell do you think you're doing? And the young man said, sir, I am absolutely honored and delighted to be in this company. I've always wanted to work for this company. I'm delighted to serve you as my boss, but I just need you to know one thing. I'm not going to lie for you. And you need to know this, because if I can lie for you, you know that I can always also lie against you. And I want you to be assured I'm never going to lie against you, because I really respect this company and what it's trying to do. But you must also know I'm never going to lie for you. In a bold statement, that young man made really clear he was not there to people please. Those were his values. It's an entirely true story. The young man became a very, very successful man in that organization and got promoted very, very quickly in that organization, determined to stick to his values and to make that very clear from the beginning. Only too easy to turn a blind eye, to try and fit in, not to upset the apple cart, just like the church in Corinth. So, to what degree do we find it just too easy to serve others and to people please? Well, what about serving ourselves? Are you one of the WIIFM group? I'm going to look at my marketing expert just here. Have you come across WIIFM? Okay, this is a marketing crash course for you. We'll catch up on this one later. Smartmouthcommunications.com have copywritten this logo. Allnewbusiness.com says WIIFM is a term used to describe what the audience will get out of using or buying a product. Other sites confirm WIIFM will help you to create better copy. There are YouTube clips out there on how you can apply the WIIFM principle. One of them is literally entitled WIIFM and Influencing. It's got to be important. WIIFM, what's in it for me? Are we part of the what's in it for me crowd? Rachel and I, my wife and I, both worked for the same university a few years ago. And I was brought into this university at the time, originally as a capacity builder, which I think meant that my job it was like a business development job. My job was to grow business for the university and to find new ways in which it could expand into its existing context. So I had to frequently go back to my boss with ideas and suggestions, and I remember having sort of taken a couple of weeks to suss out the opportunities. I went for my first meeting, and I knew that when I met with him, I'm going to have to say to him, look, we're going to need a little bit of your time because you're the boss. We're going to need your authorization on some resources, but just look at the payback that the organization is going to get if we do this, this, and this. And he listened to it carefully. He said, okay, He said, I can see why that's good for you because that's what your job is, to capacity build. I can see why that's good for the university. But what you haven't told me is what's in it for me. I said, really? On the inside, I said, really? And I'm thinking, I hadn't anticipated that was part of my job criteria. But how easy is it to live in that what's in it for me mindset? What am I getting out of this? You know, it's a challenge, isn't it? It's so easy. And the marketing people, forgive me, I told you I'd pick on you for telling me you're into marketing today. Our marketing people focus so much on drawing that attention to, how can you get, as it were, the most out of this? We might see a little bit more of that in a few minutes. Who do we really serve? Are we really serving God? Are we only too focused on ourselves? What's in it for me? Or is it about just trying to please others, go with the flow? Paul wasn't the first to challenge the church. Remember, shortly after Jesus entered Jerusalem in the week prior to his arrest and crucifixion, he went to the temple courts and he was so shocked by the behavior and the permissiveness of the religious leaders of the time that Matthew writes, Jesus entered the temple courts, drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Clearly, Jesus was no people pleaser. Jesus was not a what's in it for me kind of person, was he? He's looking for a church who is wholeheartedly devoted to him. After all, isn't the church often referred to as the bride of Christ? Who looks for a bride who's only partially interested in her groom? When I met... No, I'm not going to go there. No. Let's stick with Corinth. The church in Corinth was full of people pleasers. To turn the blind eye, to overlook the wrong behavior. And we'll see just in a few moments closing evidence of this. To blend in with local community and the culture of its time. After all, to Corinthianize. This was Corinth, wasn't it? Yeah? People in that church looking out for themselves, for the fulfillment of their own pleasures. Into that messy context, Paul writes back. And normally Paul is so eloquent with his words, so gentle and so encouraging. But you read these 3 chapters. Time doesn't allow us to unpack all of them, but I encourage you to read it. And don't read the chapters with a judging eye, but rather read it reflectively and ask yourself, in what ways can I similarly be caught out by similar types of temptations and challenges to fit in with the stereotypes of this world? As Christians, followers of Jesus, we are called to be in the world, but not of the world. How many times have we heard that? In the world, but not of the world. But it's so easy to over-focus on being culturally relevant, culturally accepted, keen to fit in, people-pleasing, not wishing to upset people or upturn the apple cart, or perhaps even so consumed with ourselves. Why? Because the marketing people tell us we're worth it. So why not focus on ourselves? What else do we hear? Well, the messages that are all around us. Just do it. Go on. Well, here are some of Paul's comments to the church in Corinth, really quickly as we wrap up. First thing he says, well, I care little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I don't even judge myself. Paul wasn't bothered about what people thought of him. He was no people pleaser. A couple of verses later, don't go, he says, beyond what is written. Listen, we've got the Bible for a reason. The Bible's there to give us guidance. Let's keep our views and our practices biblical. He moves on. I'm writing this, he says, not to shame you, but to warn you as my dear children. This is Paul being, in one sense, prepared to lose face to ensure the church was properly challenged about the compromise that it was going through at the time. He goes on, however, to say, but some of you have become arrogant. Harsh words. Harsh words. I kind of read this and I thought, my goodness, Paul was pointing the finger at me and saying this. Would I be utterly defensive Or would I reflect for a moment and say, well, where are the grounds? Am I really not guilty, Your Honour? Or are there parts of my life that are not yet fully surrendered? Gets worse. Let's go into 1 Corinthians 5. This leaves a bad taste. A man is sleeping with his father's wife, and you are proud? You are proud? Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning? He goes on, and eventually he says, your boasting is not good. He reminds them, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexual immorality or sexually immoral people, or the greedy, or swindlers, or idolaters, and the list goes on. Then he starts to look at the way that the church are accusing one another in public courts, often in very petty contexts, and says, well, I am saying this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? Come on, guys. He goes on, the very fact that you've got lawsuits among you means you've been completely defeated already. Well, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you cheat yourselves. You do wrong, and you do this to your brothers and sisters. Think about the reputation of the church. And finally, as he sums up, do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? And then he lists, just in case they haven't got it from the previous 3 chapters, he lists again all the things that he's already said. The idolatry, the sexual immorality, the theft, the greed, the drunkenness, the debauchery. He said, and this is what some of you were. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of God. This talk is not really, I don't believe, about trying to make us feel bad or to demonstrate that we've all fallen short, although I'm pretty sure if those angels did do that audit, they'd find that none of us quite make 100%, if we're really honest. I certainly wouldn't, far short. But it's a reminder that Jesus came in mercy. Jesus came that we should have life restored. Jesus came with that promise, and you've heard me say this many times, forgiveness from the past, a new life today, and a hope for the future. Or as I think I mentioned it earlier this morning in a conversation, Jesus loves us just as we are, but too much to want to leave us there, doesn't he? He loves us just as we are, but too much to want to leave us there. And as we often say during communion, Jesus, who was whole, became broken on a cross, so that we who in our humanity and our very nature are broken might be made whole. So let's live as whole people, shall we? Wholly devoted to God. Not people-pleasing, not asking what's in it for me, but to serve. Or as Paul puts it in his letter to the church at Philippi, just at the top there, he said this, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Jesus models this. To thrive, to live, is to serve God. So how do we respond? What's the answer to this? It's a big ask if we're trying to fix something in our own strength, isn't it? How long have we spent in our lives trying to fix something about us that seems to be a repeated pattern, or that seems to be something that keeps coming back to sting us? We know our own shortcomings, we know our own struggles, and this is not about finger pointing today. Whether we're people pleasers, whether we're prepared to compromise, whether we're struggling to serve against the temptations, just like the Corinth church was, or to pursue our own personal gains. We can't do this, Scott, can we? But God in us can. Only he has the power to transform us. The story of Paul's relationship with Corinth doesn't end there. It doesn't end with a letter and some harsh words. 2 or 3 years later, not surprisingly, Paul finds himself back in Corinth. And actually, it's whilst he's there, determined to support them as they're wrestling through those challenges, that he writes another letter to the church in Rome. And in that are some very familiar verses that Phil and Andrew, Tracy and I have used many times over the last few months from Romans 12. In view of God's mercy, in view of all that Jesus did on that cross, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Jesus invites us to be transformed, but we have a choice. Are we going to continue to look to people pleasing? Are we going to focus in continuously on ourselves, if we're honest? Or are we actively seeking out God, looking for him, who is the only one that has the capacity and the power to transform us? During my retreat last weekend with the Synergy leaders, I was challenged about how much space and time I provide for God to come in his transforming power. I was reminded of an author, Ruth Haley Barton, who says of transformation that transformation, guys, it's the process by which Jesus is formed in us. Why? For the glory of God, but also for the abundance of our own lives and for the sake of others. Jesus in us for the glory of God, for the abundance of our own lives and for the sake of others. It's when we stop trying to conform to the pattern of this world, to people please, to focus in on ourselves, to stop trying to be better from the outside in, trying to fix stuff. That's when God starts to transform us, when we come honestly and humbly before him from the inside out. Let's pray.